My fiancée demanded a $300,000 wedding. Her ultimatum backfired spectacularly. For 3 years, I believed I knew the woman I was going to marry. I thought I knew her heart, her values, her dreams. 6 months before our wedding, standing in the middle of our sun-drenched apartment, that belief was systematically and brutally dismantled. It was a conversation that started, as so many arguments do, over something trivial and ended with the complete and utter annihilation of our shared future. It started with flowers. My fiancée, let's call her Amelia, was scrolling through a tablet, her face a mask of intense concentration. She showed me a quote from her preferred floral designer, a name I didn't recognize, but which I immediately knew was code for absurdly expensive. The number on the screen was $12,000. For centerpieces, $12,000, I repeated, my voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, sickening dread. For flowers that will be dead in a week, I suggested, gently, that we could probably find similar, equally beautiful arrangements for a fraction of that price. She laughed. It wasn't a warm, amused laugh. It was a short, sharp, and deeply condescending sound, the kind of laugh one reserves for a particularly naive child. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a pity that made my skin crawl. "You just don't understand what quality means." And that's when she dropped the bombshell, the one that would detonate the life we had so carefully and, I thought, lovingly built together. She announced, with a casual, almost breezy air, that our wedding budget, the one we had so meticulously and responsibly agreed upon, had somehow, mysteriously, and unilaterally ballooned to $300,000. My hands began to shake as she, with a triumphant flourish, presented her evidence. A color-coded, multi-tab spreadsheet that was a monument to her delusional and entitled aspirations. I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring into an incomprehensible scrawl of financial insanity. Venue rental for the entire weekend, a sprawling, historic estate that looked like something out of a period drama, $75,000. Photographer, a trendy, sought-after artist who specialized in ethereal, light-drenched moments, $15,000. Her dress, a confection of imported lace and hand-sewn pearls, $8,000. The list went on, a relentless, cascading avalanche of extravagance. A 10-piece band, a 5-course gourmet meal, a custom-designed ice sculpture in the shape of a swan. "Amelia," I said, my voice barely a whisper, my own hands trembling now, we agreed on a $50,000 budget. 6 months ago. We wrote it down. We both signed it. She waved a dismissive, perfectly manicured hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Oh, that," she said with a little laugh. "That was before I really started planning. Before I understood what a proper wedding, a wedding that reflects our status, actually requires. Our status. I am an accountant at a respectable, mid-sized firm. I make a decent living. I am comfortable. But I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, in the $75,000 venue rental tax bracket." I tried, with a desperate, almost pleading patience, to explain this to her. I broke down the numbers, my own accountant's brain kicking into overdrive, a frantic attempt to inject a dose of cold, hard reality into her fairy tale fantasy. I showed her what a loan of that magnitude would mean, the years, the decades of crushing debt we would be saddled with before we even began our married life. I talked about our actual, real-life financial goals, a down payment on a house, saving for retirement, the possibility of starting a family. She cut me off, her expression a mask of bored indifference. And then, with a chilling, ice-cold certainty that I will never forget, she delivered her ultimatum. $300,000, Mark, she said, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. Or there will be no wedding at all. In that single, stark, and brutal moment, I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I realized, with a clarity that was as painful as it was liberating, that I was staring at a complete and utter stranger. The woman I had fallen in love with 3 years ago, the woman I had asked to be my wife, had been practical, down to earth, a person who claimed to value experiences over material possessions, who had laughed at the ostentatious displays of wealth we sometimes witnessed. The person standing before me now, a woman who was willing to mortgage our entire future for a single, performative day of extravagant spectacle, was someone else entirely. "Then there won't be a wedding," I said, the words coming out of my mouth before I had even consciously decided to say them. But the moment they were out, I knew, with an absolute, soul-deep certainty, that I meant them. She laughed again, that same sharp, condescending sound. "You're bluffing," she said, her confidence unwavering. She reminded me of the non-refundable deposits we had already paid, the invitations that were sitting in a neat, calligraphed stack on our dining table, ready to be mailed. She reminded me of the social humiliation, the sheer, unmitigated embarrassment of backing out now. She was counting on my conflict-avoidant nature, on my well-established tendency to give in, to acquiesce, to do anything to avoid a scene. But something fundamental had shifted within me during that conversation. Maybe it was the shocking, almost breathtaking disregard she had shown for our shared financial future. Or maybe, and this was the thought that truly chilled me to the bone, it was the dawning, horrifying realization that she valued the performance of our love far more than the quiet, mundane, and often difficult reality of it. I didn't argue with her further. I didn't try to reason with her. I simply turned, walked out of her apartment, and went home to my own place, a small, quiet space that suddenly felt like a sanctuary. I sat in the silence for hours, the reality of what had just happened, of what I was about to do, settling over me not like a storm, but like a cold, quiet, and deeply resolute calm. By morning, my decision was made. The war was over before she even knew it had begun. The process of dismantling a wedding, it turns out, is far easier and quicker than building one. The first call was to the venue. The events coordinator, a woman named Brenda, who had been a model of cheerful efficiency during our planning, was audibly shocked when I informed her of the cancellation. "Is everything all right, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, her voice laced with a genuine concern that was a stark contrast to my own fiancée's cold indifference. I kept my explanation brief and professional. "There's been a change in circumstances," I said. "We will not be getting married." Because we were still just outside the 6-month cancellation window, the venue's policy allowed for a partial refund of our massive deposit, minus a small but significant processing fee. It was a financial hit, but a survivable one. The next calls were to the photographer, the caterer, the band we had so excitedly booked together. One by one, with a strange, almost surgical detachment, I dismantled the $300,000 fantasy she had so arrogantly demanded. She called me that evening, her voice a shrill, incredulous shriek. Brenda from the venue had called her to confirm our cancellation. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, the words a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage. I explained, calmly and with a patience I didn't know I possessed, that I had done exactly what she had asked. "You gave me an ultimatum, Amelia," I said. "A $300,000 wedding, or no wedding at all. Ichuza no wedding. You're getting nothing." She screamed at me then, a long, incoherent tirade of accusations and insults. I was petty. I was cruel. I was ruining her dreams, her one perfect day, out of pure, vindictive spite. I listened to her rage for several long, exhausting minutes, and then, without another word, I hung up the phone. The calls and texts continued for the next few days, a chaotic, desperate barrage of emotions. She alternated between a furious, righteous anger and a tearful, pleading vulnerability. She threatened legal action. She promised we could work something out. She begged me to reconsider. I stopped responding after the third day. She had made her choice, her values, her priorities, abundantly, painfully clear. And I had made mine. But I wasn't finished. There was one last significant piece of our shared financial life that needed to be addressed. 3 years earlier, when we had first started getting serious, she had come to me, her eyes filled with tears, her voice a mask of shame and vulnerability, and confessed that she was drowning in credit card debt. She had been living beyond her means, a habit I now saw was a chronic, defining feature of her personality. I, in a moment of what I had believed was love and support, had loaned her $25,000 to consolidate her debt and get a fresh start. We had a formal, signed loan agreement, a document that stipulated she would pay it back within 2 years. But whenever I had gently, and with an increasing sense of unease, brought it up, she would just laugh it off. "We're getting married, silly," she'd say. "It'll all be our money anyway. What does it matter?" For the past 18 months, she had also been living in my apartment, rent-free. She had claimed she was saving for our future, a future that now seemed to include a custom ice sculpture, while she continued to spend her own salary on designer handbags and expensive, boozy brunches with her friends. I gathered the documentation, the signed loan agreement, the bank transfer records, the text messages where she had, on multiple occasions, acknowledged the debt. And then I went to the local courthouse and filed a civil claim for the full $25,000, plus 3 years of accrued interest. The court papers were served to her at her office on a Wednesday afternoon. She called me within the hour, her voice a hysterical, sobbing mess. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed. "How could you do this to us?" "There is no us anymore, Amelia," I reminded her, my voice still that same, calm and unshakable monotone. "You made that perfectly clear when you chose an overpriced party over a life with me. The money you owe me is a separate matter entirely, a business transaction that exists independent of our now-defunct romantic relationship." She begged me to drop the lawsuit, her voice a pathetic, desperate plea. She promised, with a newfound and deeply unconvincing sincerity, that she would pay me back, gradually, over time. "You've had 3 years to make good on that promise," I told her, "and you chose not to." I then, for the first time, hung up on her. That weekend, I made the final liberating decision. For months, I had been considering a job offer in another state, a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase. I had turned it down, of course, because of our wedding plans, because of her. Now, with nothing tying me to this city except a collection of bad memories and a pending lawsuit, I called them back. The position, miraculously, was still available. I accepted immediately. The process of packing up the 3 years of shared memories we had accumulated in my apartment was harder than I had expected. There were photos from trips we had taken, small, thoughtful gifts she had given me for birthdays and anniversaries, little reminders of the happier times, of the woman I had thought she was. I boxed everything up methodically, a curator of my own failed relationship. I kept the things that were mine, the things that served me, and I donated the rest to charity. I had already changed the locks on my apartment, a necessary precaution. I left her remaining belongings, the few things she hadn't taken when she moved in with her parents, in a neat stack of boxes by the door, with a note explaining that they would be donated as well if they were not collected within a week. She came by on the 6th day. I watched through the peephole as she stood outside my door, knocking for 10 long, agonizing minutes, her pleas alternating with angry, muffled threats. I didn't answer. I just watched her, a ghost in my own home, as she finally gave up and, with tears streaming down her face, began the slow, humiliating process of loading box after box into her small, sensible car. A part of me, the part that had loved her so deeply, felt a pang of something that resembled pity. But I quickly reminded myself that she was the sole and undisputed author of this entire, miserable situation. The job transition was a seamless and welcome distraction. My new colleagues were welcoming. The work was challenging in a good way, and the city, a vibrant, bustling metropolis, offered a world of opportunities to build a fresh, new life. I bought a small, charming house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a home I could never have afforded while simultaneously supporting someone else's expensive and unsustainable lifestyle. For the first time in years, I felt financially secure, untethered, and genuinely, almost cautiously optimistic about the future. 6 months after I had moved, 6 months of blessed, uninterrupted silence, her mother called. I was surprised to see the number on my phone, and I almost didn't answer. But a strange, morbid curiosity got the better of me. When I picked up, her voice was shaky and desperate, a world away from the confident, judgmental tone I was used to. She explained, in a long, rambling, and tearful monologue, that Amelia was in serious, catastrophic financial trouble. The wedding debt, the debt she had so recklessly and arrogantly accumulated in the 2 months after I had canceled everything, had spiraled completely and utterly out of control. Her credit card were maxed out, her loan payments were in default, and she was now facing the very real and very public humiliation of bankruptcy. Her mother begged me, with a desperation that was almost pathetic, to drop the civil suit. She claimed that Amelia had learned her lesson and simply couldn't afford to pay both the court-ordered judgment and all of her other self-inflicted debts. She even offered to pay half the amount herself, to liquidate a portion of her own retirement savings, if I would just accept that as a final settlement. I listened to her plea without interrupting, a silent, patient observer to the slow, agonizing implosion of their lives. When she was finally finished, her words hanging in the air like a bad smell, I explained, with the same calm, unassailable logic that had guided me through this entire ordeal, that financial consequences were the natural and unavoidable result of financial decisions. Your daughter, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, chose to continue planning and paying for an expensive and entirely fictional wedding for 2 months after I had clearly and unequivocally canceled it. That shows a fundamental and deeply concerning lack of judgment that has absolutely nothing to do with me. I asked her, my voice a quiet, pointed question, why she believed that her daughter's poor, reckless, and frankly, insane decisions were now my responsibility to fix. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line before she finally, and with a defeated sigh, admitted that she didn't think it was fair, but that she was just a mother, desperate to help her child. I felt a flicker of something, a genuine, human sympathy for her position, for the impossible situation her own daughter had put her in, but I remained firm. The debt her daughter owed me was a legal and moral obligation that existed entirely independent of any other financial troubles she had so recklessly and arrogantly created for herself. After I hung up, a new wave of morbid curiosity propelled me to do some digging. Through a network of mutual friends and some simple but effective social media detective work, I uncovered the full and truly astonishing extent of her denial. For 2 months after our relationship had ended, she had continued to live in a fantasy world, a world where our wedding was still happening. She had told everyone, her friends, her family, that we were just working through some things and that the wedding was back on. New, non-refundable deposits were paid. Her dress alterations were completed. New, more extravagant, catering contract were signed. It was a performance of such breathtaking delusion that it was almost impressive. Her social media from that period was a gallery of her denial. There were photos of dress fittings, of venue tours, of cake tastings, all posted weeks, sometimes even a month, after our relationship had officially, and in her case legally, ended. The comments from confused friends, from people who had received my cancellation email, were met with vague, dismissive responses about how everything is complicated, but we're working it out. It was both profoundly sad and deeply infuriating to see how she had constructed this elaborate, expensive, and ultimately doomed fiction rather than simply accepting the reality of her own choices. A year after I had left the city and our shared life behind, the court finally, and with a satisfying, almost anticlimactic finality, ruled in my favor. The judgment was for the full $25,000, plus interest, plus all of my court costs. Her wages were garnished at a rate of 15%, a slow, relentless, and legally mandated repayment plan that would take her years to complete. She appealed the decision, of course, her legal filings a desperate, last-ditch attempt to claim financial hardship. But the appeal was swiftly denied. The signed loan agreement, the text messages acknowledging the debt, they were all there, in black and white, an irrefutable testament to her obligation. Around the same time, I learned through the ever-active grapevine of our former mutual connections that she had been forced to move back in with her parents. Her credit was in ruins, a scorched earth of defaults and delinquencies that made it impossible for her to even rent an apartment on her own. She had taken a second job, waiting tables at night, to supplement her meager office income, a desperate, exhausting attempt to stay ahead of the rising tide of her various debt obligations. Some people in our former social circle, I heard, whispered that I was being vindictive, that I was kicking her while she was down. But others, the ones who knew the full story, the ones who had seen her own words in that damning text message, pointed out that she had created this situation entirely, and with a breathtaking arrogance, through her own choices. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt resolved. She had shown me, in the clearest, most unambiguous terms possible, that her vision of our shared life was fundamentally and irrevocably incompatible with reality. And her actions in the months after our breakup had only served to confirm that initial, brutal assessment. The small, regular garnishment checks began to arrive in my mailbox monthly, a quiet, almost comical, clockwork reminder of the bullet I had so narrowly and so decisively dodged, the lifetime of financial and emotional ruin I had so narrowly avoided by simply walking away when her true and truly terrifying priorities had become clear. I deposited each one into a new savings account, an account I had earmarked for the down payment on my first house, a house I could now afford because I hadn't saddled myself and my future with someone else's expensive and entirely delusional fantasies. My new life had settled into a comfortable, peaceful rhythm. My work was fulfilling. I had made a small but solid circle of genuine friends. And I was dating someone new, a kind, intelligent, and refreshingly down-to-earth woman who shared my values about money, about partnership, about responsibility. When I cautiously, and with a great deal of trepidation, told her the story of my previous relationship, she was shocked, not by my actions, but by the sheer, unmitigated audacity of my ex's demands. Her reaction, her simple, unadorned validation, was a healing balm on a wound I hadn't even realized was still tender. 2 years after I'd left, her mother called again. This time, the desperation in her voice was even more pronounced, a raw, ragged sound of a woman at the end of her rope. Amelia, she told me, had been sued by 3 of the wedding vendors she had contracted with after our breakup, and she was now facing wage garnishments from multiple, competing sources. The accumulated interest and legal fees had transformed what were once manageable debts into a crushing, insurmountable mountain of financial ruin. She was, her mother told me, seriously considering bankruptcy, a move that would permanently scar her career and her financial future. Her mother made a new, and even more desperate, offer. They would pay the full, remaining amount of my judgment immediately, in a single, lump sum payment, if I would do one thing for them in return. She needed me to provide a letter, a formal letter on my company letterhead, stating that my ex-fiancée had been cooperative and professional in resolving our outstanding debt. She needed this letter, she explained, to present to her daughter's employer, as the multiple, ongoing wage garnishments were raising serious questions about her financial responsibility and her overall judgment. Her mother, she confessed, was willing to liquidate a significant portion of her own retirement savings to make this happen. I considered the offer carefully. The money, a lump sum of just over $32,000, would certainly be useful. But something about the request, about the inherent dishonesty of it, bothered me. My ex had not been cooperative or professional. She had been the absolute, dictionary definition opposite of those things. Writing a letter claiming otherwise would be a lie that would help her avoid the very consequences she had so legitimately and so thoroughly earned. I made a counteroffer. I would accept the full payment, I told her, and I would provide a letter confirming that the debt had been satisfied in full. But I would not, under any circumstances, make false statements about her conduct. The letter would be strictly and almost brutally factual, debt paid. Matter closed. Her mother, desperate for any solution, any port in the storm, accepted immediately. The wire transfer arrived within 48 hours. I provided the agreed-upon letter, a cold, clinical, and deeply satisfying document, and I considered our business and our shared history, finally, and for all time, concluded. 6 months later, I proposed to my girlfriend. The ring, a simple, elegant piece that cost less than one of Amelia's rejected centerpiece arrangements, was perfect. She said yes, her eyes shining with a joy that was real, not performative. We planned our wedding in 3 months, a small, intimate ceremony in a local park, followed by a raucous, joyful dinner at our favorite neighborhood restaurant. The total cost was under $5,000, and it was the most perfect, most beautiful day of my life. It was a reflection of who we actually were, not who we wanted the world to think we were. The final, almost comical, irony came, as it so often does, through social media. My ex, I saw, had posted photos from a small, drab, and almost sad-looking courthouse wedding to a man I didn't recognize. The caption was a long, rambling ode to finding true love and learning what really matters in life. A part of me, the better, more generous part, hoped that she had genuinely learned from her mistakes. But I suspected, with a cynical certainty, that the modest, uninstagrammable ceremony had far more to do with her ruined credit and her depleted finances than any real, meaningful personal growth. Looking back, I realized that walking away from that $300,000 ultimatum was the single best financial and emotional decision I have ever made. It was the moment I learned to value myself enough, to respect myself enough, to refuse to be a supporting actor in someone else's expensive and ultimately empty fantasy.